Shin Megami Tensei V is one of the most ambitious titles Atlus has ever produced. Ever since the game's initial reveal back in 2017, SMT V has easily become one of my most anticipated video game releases in a long time. As the years went on and more of the game was teased and shown off, Shin Megami Tensei V was shaping up to be the next big leap for the entire Megami Tensei franchise, and the fact that the game is finally out is a bit surreal to me. I know that this is a bit of an odd way to start off a video game review, but I feel it's important to establish my perspective right off the bat. I'm a massive fan of this series. I've easily sunk hundreds of hours into these games, both in my free time and in making videos discussing each entry on this channel. As a result, there is a bit of an inherent bias with my perspective, but something that I want to make abundantly clear is that while I do like these games, I'm not a blind fanboy that's willing to overlook their faults. I want this series to be the best it can be, and in order to do so, I need to put aside my biases and give my honest thoughts. So for today's video, we're going to be breaking down what makes this game stand out amongst its peers, analyzing the highs and lows to determine if Shin Megami Tensei V is a worthy addition to the mainline franchise. But before any of that, I need to give a few disclaimers. I was provided with a review copy of this game from Sega and Atlus, and while I'm very humbled to be given this opportunity, all thoughts and opinions expressed in this video are strictly my own, and I will not be going easy on the game because of this. The second thing I need to mention is that there are going to be major spoilers throughout this video. Shin Megami Tensei V is brand new, and I'm the kind of person that likes to give an in-depth look at the games I talk about on this channel. I'll be sure to give a second warning before delving into any story spoilers, but gameplay mechanics and design elements are going to be discussed in detail. So if you want to avoid that, then I suggest you play the game yourself before watching this video. With all that said and done, it's time we take a dive into Shin Megami Tensei V. Our story begins, innocently enough, in modern-day Tokyo, where you play as a high school student. Lately, some strange rumors have been circulating involving shadowy monsters attacking and killing people. Paranoia has swept over Tokyo, and it's gotten to the point where the buddy system has been implemented at the protagonist's high school. One day, on their way back to the dorms, your fellow classmates end up investigating the tunnels the rumors stem from, and you end up following them inside to make sure they stay safe. However, upon stepping inside, everything goes south as an earthquake erupts and the tunnel collapses. Instead of killing the protagonist, this seems to have transported the young man and his classmates to a post-apocalyptic Tokyo known as the Netherworld, where they're attacked by demons. Before they can land the killing blow, a mysterious figure named Aogami descends from the sky and beckons the protagonist to take his hand. With nothing to lose, the young man fuses with Aogami and transforms into a being called a Nahobino. After dealing with the demons, we're given our objective: find our classmates and search for a way to get back home. All the while we learn more about the Netherworld and what exactly the implications of this new Nahobino form are. The introduction to Shin Megami Tensei V is much shorter compared to the other games in the series, but at the same time, it tries to pack in a lot of information at once. We get the introduction to some of the major players in the plot before we're quickly thrusted into the Netherworld. There isn't any time to absorb what's going on in the plot before we're let loose onto the first major gameplay area. The intention was to instill a sense of confusion within the player, which allows them to connect to the main character in some regard. The motivation for exploring the Netherworld is mainly to learn more about it. It's very much a fish out of water scenario where we learn more about the world as our characters do. I just can't help but shake the feeling that we were thrown into the action just a bit too quickly. Let's compare the intro of SMT V to Nocturne's for a second, since they have a lot in common with each other. Nocturne starts off with you and your high school friends visiting your teacher at the hospital. Recently, a riot broke out at Yoyogi Park, and it's rumored to be the work of a cult. These rumors have put the town on edge, and this cult plays a big part in Nocturne's story. This intro is a bit longer than the one in SMT V, but I think that it does a much better job at introducing the player into the world while also establishing its cast along with the general tone of the game. This calm before the storm does a great job at instilling the player with a sense of unease as they explore the abandoned hospital. The game gives you nuggets of information to pique your curiosity, while also keeping the story close enough to get you thinking. In comparison, SMT V has little breathing room, as you're almost immediately thrust into the post-apocalyptic Netherworld. I can only assume that Atlus intentionally wanted to make you feel confused and overwhelmed by this scenario so that your imagination can run wild. Your curiosity is meant to be your motivation to press on and explore the Netherworld, and if this is your first SMT game, then I can see this being immediately intriguing. But as a player that has a lot of baggage with this series, I find it to be just okay, and prefer the way that this similar concept was handled in other games. And let's just say that this isn't the only time I felt this way about the narrative, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. Let's put a pin in this discussion for now, and cover the new gameplay additions first. Ever since Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne, the mainline entire series has been using the press turn battle system. You exploit enemy weaknesses and land critical hits to give your party extra turns. There's a large focus on buffing yourself, debuffing the enemies, and using the pass command to come up with on-the-fly strategies. Each installment makes its own tweaks and changes to the formula in order to stand out from each other. Shin Megami Tensei IV introduced the smirk system into combat in an attempt to keep things fresh, and Apocalypse mostly focused on refining the concepts featured in 4 to near perfection. SMT V follows the same trend of providing its own unique gameplay experience on top of putting a new spin on previous ideas. Gone is the smirk system from the SMT IV duology, and in is the Magatsuhi gauge. After every turn in battle, the Magatsuhi gauge will increase slightly. Once it's full, you can spend the meter to execute a special action that doesn't use up any press turn icons. The list of Magatsuhi skills you have access to varies depending on the race of demons you have in your active party. There's a wide variety of skills for you to choose from, such as lowering the MP cost of skills, dealing severe almighty damage to all enemies, inflicting ailments to all enemies while also debuffing them, and the list goes on. This is a very interesting idea on paper. It reminds me a lot of the assist gauge that was featured in Apocalypse, but a lot more balanced and far more controllable. However, the execution of this idea isn't quite there yet. While you do gain access to a healthy amount of Magatsuhi skills, a lot of them are very situational, with only a few of them being truly useful. It can be argued, and I will argue, that the Magatsuhi skill you start with, Omagatoki Critical, is one of, if not the best Magatsuhi skill in the game. This skill makes it so if you land an attack on an enemy, whether that be physical or magic, it will count as a critical hit. This is a great skill for a few reasons. This skill is non-exclusive to any race, which means you can activate it regardless of which demons you have in your party. You can also activate this skill on anyone's turn, so there's a lot more flexibility to be had. And finally, because the press turn system is designed to reward critical hits with extra turns, you can use this to come up with all kinds of strategies. Do you use this opportunity to go all in and have everyone attack? Or maybe you have a few party members attack while the others provide support. There's a lot you can do with this skill, and it ends up becoming the one a lot of players fall back on. I pretty much exclusively use this skill since it opened up plenty of opportunities. That isn't to say that the other Magatsuhi skills are bad, mind you. Every single one of them is inherently useful since they don't cost any MP or take up any turns. I just find that most of them are far more situational than the Omagatoki Critical skill, which could be a sign of either poor balancing or lack of incentive to experiment. Guaranteed critical hits are just a lot more enticing to me than buffing my party, especially in the end of the game when I'm able to do that myself with relative ease. Speaking of which, buffs and debuffs have been heavily altered this time around. Taking a page out of the Persona series, buffs now only last for a limited number of turns and initially start off as single target spells. However, unlike the modern Persona games, buffs can be stacked up to 2 levels. From what I've gathered, this change is a bit of a contentious one. People mainly cite the cost of maintaining buffs as the reason for disliking it, but to be honest, I find this change to be a straight improvement for a few reasons. In previous games, buffs had a set it and forget it mentality. Most boss battles fell into the same formula: fully buff your team, fully debuff the enemy, and then go to town with your most powerful skills. Sure, some bosses would behave differently depending on the number of buffs in play, mostly retaliating by removing your buffs and debuffs, but most of the time, buffs were just a static power-up that you could always use. Apocalypse attempted to make buffs a bit more interesting because of how the MP economy was balanced. Late game skills such as Luster Candy and Debilitate had an insanely high cost, so you had to consider the consequences for using up that much MP. However, if the enemy in question didn't have skills like Dekaja or Dakunda, then there was no reason to not use your high cost skills. SMT V adds restrictions to buffs and debuffs, not just for balancing, but also for the sake of keeping those skills dynamic. Because of their set time limit, buffs are now something that you have to actively manage throughout a battle. Combine this with their higher than usual MP cost, and you're presented with a system that's far more engaging. You need to decide not only if the temporary boost in power is necessary for the fight, but also when you cast it so you don't just waste a large portion of MP without taking full advantage of the spells. You're also rewarded for building demons around the core idea of buffing and debuffing, not just because of the returning skill affinity system, but because of the inclusion of a new passive skill. Boon Boost, and later on Boon Boost EX, extend the duration of buffs and debuffs by 1 and 2 turns respectively. Including this skill on any support demon will help you get the most out of buffs and debuffs, but at the same time, this sacrifices one of your skill slots. It's decision making like this that keeps support skills feeling fresh throughout the entire game. While this supplemental use of buffs might not be everyone's cup of tea, I find it to be a far more interesting system than what we had previously. When it comes to the core changes to the battle system, that's honestly about it. Things are more derivative than innovative this time around, but I don't see this as a bad thing because it's the changes made to the gameplay outside of the combat system that have a much larger impact on the series, and I say this in the best possible way. Let's start off with character customization. Ever since Nocturne, every mainline installment has tried their hand at shaking up the way we can build our demons, as well as how we can customize the protagonist. Nocturne used Magatama to change the player's resistances, and also reward them with new skills when they reach certain levels. And 4 had the demon whispering system, which allowed players to copy skills from their demons to the protagonist once the demon in question learned all of its natural skills. SMT V steers away from the direction those games took and does something different. One of the main collectibles you can find in the open areas are demon essences. Think of them as a copy of a demon's skill and affinity that's stored in your inventory. You can get these essences by finding them in chests, completing side missions, or as a rare reward when you level up your demon. The main purpose of demon essences is to bestow that demon's skill on any of your party members. However, for the Nahobino, they can be used to change its elemental resistances. There are 2 limitations with the demon essence system. Just like with regular demon fusion, you cannot transfer over a demon's unique skill, and secondly, you can only hold onto 1 copy of an essence at a time, and the more powerful ones are usually a one and done sort of deal, but it is possible to get more copies of an essence by grinding or doing repeated playthroughs if you really want to. While this may seem restrictive at first, I find these limitations are in service of providing the player with constantly engaging decision making. You need to not only decide which party member you'll use the essence on, but also what skills they'll inherit, or in the case of the Nahobino, whether or not you'll use the essence to change his resistances. You're encouraged to gather as many essences as possible so that you have more options to play around with. Even if you pick up an essence that isn't immediately useful to you, it can still serve a purpose to you down the line, either because it has a good passive skill for a future demon, or in case you need to change your resistances for a boss battle. But remember, you can only hold onto 1 copy of an essence at a time, so there's a lot of thought that goes into how you use them. That's not all for character customization either, because miracles are another form of character progression you have access to. The core idea is very similar to the app system from SMT IV, but with some changes and rebalances. New miracles have been introduced relating to the Magatsuhi gauge, and some of the more exploitable apps from 4 have been removed. Since SMT V doesn't use the demon whispering system from the previous installment, skill affinity is handled through the miracle system, and I find this to be a welcome change. In SMT IV, elemental affinity was tied directly to the skills you had on the protagonist. Every time one of your demons would enter the whisper state, whatever skills your protagonist shared with them would have their affinity increased by a single rank. This would improve that skill's general efficiency, and was something that you were encouraged to use often, especially in Apocalypse. The only issue I have is that skill affinity on the protagonist was only truly useful around the endgame, since whenever you got a new skill, it would start without any affinity. In SMT V, you now have to purchase miracles to increase your elemental affinity. However, they're now permanent upgrades and will stick with your character regardless of their current skill loadout. It's a slightly different way of handling the idea, but I prefer how it's handled here since the affinity boost feels a lot more substantial. On its own, the character customization offers a lot for you to sink your teeth into. While these ideas are more so new takes on concepts previously featured in the SMT series, there's enough done here to make the customization stand out. However, what elevates the character progression of SMT V to new heights has to be how it's integrated directly into the exploration, in a way that no other game in the series has done before. SMT V features a total of 4 hub areas for you to explore. While this isn't exactly an open world game, there's plenty of opportunities for you to go off the beaten path and look for goodies, and the way that the game encourages this is brilliant. Something you'll notice early on is that certain parts of the map are covered by this purple fog. In order to clear it, you need to kill what are known as abscesses. Think of it as SMT V's equivalent to the terminal encounters in 4. Once you do that, not only do you clear the fog from that area, but you also unlock a new set of miracles to purchase. But in order to buy said miracles, you need to spend glory points, which can be attained by either finding these glory crystals or by discovering any of the 200 Mimons scattered throughout the game. You're also rewarded for every set of 5 Mimons you collect. You can earn exclusive essences you otherwise wouldn't get, obtain new Magatsuhi skills, and even get some powerful consumable items. These rewards give the exploration in SMT V a lot more weight and meaning because it all cycles back into the character progression. There's always something to find in the Netherworld, and because of that, you're given a reason to explore. The world itself ended up becoming one of my favorite aspects of SMT V. The series has been trapped on 6 generations generation hardware at best for years. While Atlus absolutely did the best they could with what they had, there was always a thought in the back of my mind that some of these ideas had to be compromised because of their platform. While the Switch isn't the most powerful piece of hardware out there, the vision of the developers feels much more realized than previously. Things such as seeing enemies roam around on the map before encountering them, and having them react differently depending on your level adds a splash of life to this otherwise desolate world. Some of the more powerful demons such as Giri Makala, the Four Heavenly Kings, and Huang Long absolutely tower over the player, which does a great job at conveying how much of a threat they are at the start of the game. This makes it extra cathartic to eventually take them down before making them a fixture in your party. I know that RPGs have been doing this for a while, but the fact that SMT is finally able to follow this trend makes me happy. However, this ambition does come at the cost of a few technical hiccups. While the maps you explore are massive, the game does suffer a lot from pop-in and some noticeable draw distance tricks. Objects fade in around you as you walk around, and demons you can see off in the distance have their animations play at half the frame rate, on top of being lower quality models in general. This was all done to save on system resources so the game could run at a stable 30 FPS, and it's a sacrifice that I'm willing to overlook, but that's not to say that there aren't any frame drops in the game. Whenever you load into an area, whether that be because you're fast traveling or exiting the world of shadows, the game's frame rate momentarily tanks before stabilizing. It can be very distracting, and I hope that this is something that can be smoothed out with updates, or even a potential port to other platforms, but I'm not going to hold my breath for that. While SMT V is mainly focused on large open maps, there are a couple of more traditional dungeons too, and they're okay overall. Each dungeon features its own unique gimmick. The first one has these wind tunnels that are initially introduced as an obstacle before the idea is flipped on its head for progression. The final floor of the dungeon combines both of these ideas together, and it's pretty fulfilling because of it. The Temple of Eternity dungeon, on the other hand, is rather simplistic. It's pretty much a giant maze where you have to avoid the enemies patrolling the area while also finding the correct path to make progress. There is a secondary mechanic where you can walk through these gates to either pause or resume time, but the idea is very underutilized. When time is paused, you can't get into random encounters, open chests, or proceed through the closed doors. So the idea here is that you need to avoid walking through certain gates in order to progress. Instead of doing anything interesting with the idea of time being paused, they instead act as walls with a fancy coat of paint. And since this mechanic only appears early on in the dungeon and isn't reincorporated like the wind tunnels were in the previous dungeon, it feels as though this was cut content, but I can't be too sure about that. I hear a lot of people struggled with the dungeons and resent them solely because of their gimmicks, and I don't really agree with that statement. It's because of gimmicks like this that dungeon exploration is fun and memorable. While it isn't anything complex, the fact that some thought has to go into how you traverse the dungeons makes things far more interesting. Something that I didn't like about SMT IV was that despite their aesthetics, every dungeon felt homogenized in their design. This was because almost all of them lacked any defining gameplay quirk that you needed to take into account. While SMT V's dungeons aren't perfect, I think that they serve their purpose as a nice shake-up from the usual exploration. The last thing I want to discuss involving the gameplay is the optional content. Much like SMT IV, there are plenty of side quests for you to tackle, however their quality is a bit of a mixed bag. There are some quests that I find rather interesting, such as the ones where you need to fight demons that you otherwise wouldn't face, like the Archangels, Baal, Danu, and a few others. Some quests even allow you to side with demons you're supposed to kill, and you'll get a different reward for doing so, which is pretty cool. Not every quest is created equally, however, since there are a few quests that can be best described as MMO quests. You know the ones. Quests that are very unfulfilling gameplay-wise, but you do them for the sake of a reward. These can range from killing a certain number of random mobs to finding and delivering items that are marked on your map. Some quests even just boil down to handing over consumable items in exchange for better items. It's nothing to write home about, but just like in SMT IV, the rewards you get for completing these quests are good enough justification for doing them. However, if you aren't quite satisfied with the side quests, SMT V does include some DLC that might be up your alley. But before I describe what's on offer here, there's something that I have to say. I'm not a fan of Day 1 DLC at all, mostly because it's content that should have been in the game at launch, but was taken out for the sake of squeezing a few extra bucks out of the player base. I understand that this is the norm nowadays and Atlus aren't the only ones guilty of doing this, but this practice is bullshit regardless of the quality of the product in question. Anyways, there are three distinct types of DLC. There's the grinding DLC that increases the rate Mitama demons spawn, and the DLC that gives you new side quests that end with unlocking a new demon for fusion. There's the returning Cleopatra and Mephisto, along with a DLC focused around the demon Artemis, who received an updated redesign. I personally didn't buy these ones since the quests tied to them looked really lame in comparison to the ones in 4 Apocalypse. Apocalypse. However, one DLC that I can recommend is the Return of the True Demon DLC. This questline is a huge callback to Nocturne. It sees you fighting the same fiends in the same order as that game before facing off with the Demi-Fiend himself, who is easily the most difficult boss in the entire game. Out of all of the DLC featured here, this one has the most value. My only gripe with it is that the fiend fights are designed for you to tackle them throughout your first playthrough, meaning that if you bought the DLC after already reaching level 99, then you'll absolutely steamroll through them. The Demi-Fiend fight, on the other hand, is super challenging, even with the best demons in the game and high stats. While there exists a strategy involving repelling physical attacks and summoning in demons to exploit his AI, the Demi-Fiend fight is brutal and can end in a single turn if you aren't careful. If you manage to beat him, you're rewarded with his essence, which either allows you to null every element, or allow you to inherit some of his exclusive skills. It's mostly bragging rights, but being able to one-shot almost everything with Gaia Rage and Chaotic Will is so satisfying. It's the ultimate mark to prove that you've got nothing left to prove. Overall, Shin Megami Tensei V might have the strongest core gameplay in the entire franchise, and I don't say that lightly. The battle system takes some of the best parts of 4 Apocalypse and tweaks them even further by rebalancing buffs and adding new systems of its own. But what pushes the gameplay here beyond what's featured in Apocalypse is the exploration, and how it's given a new meaning since it ties into character progression. No other game in the series has emphasized exploration to this degree, and I love that it was used to its fullest extent. I only have 2 gripes with the gameplay. The Magatsuhi skills are a great idea that just needs some fine tuning. There isn't enough incentive to try out other Magatsuhi skills because the one you start off with is just too good. While there are some powerful alternatives to a Magatoki Critical, they're a lot more situational and don't offer the same amount of versatility. I also think that the Temple of Eternity is a pretty weak dungeon since the main gameplay gimmick is barely used. The concept of pausing and resuming time could have provided us with puzzles that would require some clever thinking. However, those are just a few blemishes on what is otherwise a rewarding gameplay experience. If we're just judging SMT V based on its gameplay, then I can easily say it's my favorite game in the series hands down. However, there still is a story to cover, and if I'm being honest, it's the game's weakest aspect. I can absolutely recommend SMT V if you're looking for a fun but challenging JRPG. However, if you're the kind of player that enjoys story above all else, then I think you're going to be sorely disappointed. That's not to say that the story is terrible, but it's heavily flawed. In order to explain why, I'm going to have to dive deep into spoiler territory. If what you've seen of SMT V has interested you so far, then I highly suggest you play the game yourself before watching the rest of this video. With that being said, let's go into a bit more detail as to what's going on here. To give a brief reminder, the story of SMT V follows a young high school student who, after being sent to the netherworld, fuses with this mysterious man named Aogami and transforms into a being known as the Nahobino. Your initial goal is to search for your classmates and find out what happened to the world. However, things become a bit more complicated by the end of the first area. We discover that an Amala drum is hidden within the Tokyo Diet building, and by using it, the students are transported back to Tokyo and are introduced to the organization known as Bethel. Bethel is a worldwide task force dedicated to protecting the real world from demons. Some notable members of this group are your classmate Yuzuru Atsuta, Tao Itsunokami, the Archangel Abdiel, and Hayao Koshimizu, leader of the Japanese branch. It's here when the curtain is pulled back a bit. It turns out that the Tokyo we started the game in is fake, and the netherworld is the real Tokyo. 18 years prior to the game beginning, a great tragedy struck and all of Tokyo was destroyed. However, God performed a miracle and recreated Tokyo and all of its inhabitants to protect them from the demonic threat that followed. But during the war between angels and demons, God was struck down by Lucifer, and demons have been trying to find their way to invade humanity's sanctuary ever since. It's because of these demonic invasions that the rumors we heard at the start of the game surfaced. After this, the protagonist ends up joining Bethel since Koshimizu sees the power of the Nahobino as a way to put an end to the war between the forces of law and chaos. From then on, the story mostly just meanders as we work our way towards that goal. Don't get me wrong, things do happen, but the overall significance these events have on the plot is minimal. Because of this, SMT V's story feels very directionless for most of its runtime, and it isn't until the 4th and final area of the game where things start to pick up a bit. At this point in the story, the war between angels and demons has just come to a closed due to the demon king Ariok being slain by the Nahobino. However, we're not quite in the clear just yet. It's revealed that the Tokyo created by God is starting to vanish due to his absence, and the only way to save it is for a Nahobino to ascend the Empyrean and use God's throne to recreate the world. The leaders of Bethel, knowing that God's condemnation can't stop them anymore, all set out to achieve their Nahobino states, and use the throne of creation to bring about a new world rooted in their ideals. This is a lot to take in at once, but when you boil it down, the main conflict here is pretty similar to the one featured in Nocturne, and just like with that game, the concept of creating a new world is where most of the discussion on the story lies. SMT V has a total of 4 different endings, each one corresponding with the standard law, chaos, and neutral alignments, with the 4th ending acting as an alternative take on the neutral route. The alignments themselves are far more nuanced this time around, especially when compared to SMT IV, which ended up playing it rather safe with what those characters represented. However, I think that SMT IV does a much better job at naturally having alignments intertwined with the plot and characters. SMT IV spends a good majority of its story introducing us to the different factions of Tokyo. It's through the interactions with these groups that our party members are able to express their worldviews and develop their own sense of right and wrong. There's a lot of time spent building up what these characters believe in, so when the alignment split happens and you have to make the choice between siding with either Walter or Jonathan, it feels very natural, and the entire story is written around this concept. While it does take a bit of time for this conflict to be introduced, everything leading up to that point matters to this idea. I can't give the same praise to SMT V. There's a large stretch in the plot of this game that can be summarized as the cast going on missions for Bethel. While you'd think the game would use this opportunity to flesh out the characters and develop their ideals, it's something that's unfortunately wasted. The game is so focused on going from point A to B to C that there isn't much breathing room for the characters to reflect on the events that transpire. It also doesn't help that the alignment reps, generally speaking, have far less screen time than the ones from previous games. There is an exception to this rule, however. The most developed character in the game is Dazai. When he's first introduced, Dazai desperately wants to be a reliable figure that can be a valuable asset to Bethel, but he lacks the courage to do so. He ends up turning to the Archangel Abdiel for guidance. She gifts the young man with angels to use in combat and becomes a mentor figure for him. It's through the guidance of Abdiel that Dazai learns to have faith in God and his order. By the end of the game, he wants to use the throne of creation to construct a world surrounding God's ideals, to lead humanity down a righteous path. There's an okay amount of time spent building up his character, and I think the game does a decent job at showing us a natural progression in Dazai's mindset. Well, for the most part, that is. I'm not exactly a big fan of the transformation he goes through near the end of the game. There's this scene in the 4th area where Dazai finds his resolve and firmly believes that the only true salvation is in God's order. While he isn't able to bring that on his own, he knows that by teaming up with Abdiel, they'll be able to revive the world's original creator, even if that means going against God's condemnation to do so. This blatant hypocrisy in the law alignment raises some interesting questions regarding faith and commitment. In order to bring God back to life, Dazai and Abdiel would have to commit a grave sin by defying his law against the existence of a Nahobino, but at that point, what makes them any better than the other people trying to use the throne of creation? While Dazai has good intentions, it just shows how much faith they have in God. Even if they sever his divine order, it'll be worth it in the end to reinstate God as the one true ruler. For Abdiel, this makes a lot of sense since throughout the entire game, she's shown to be nothing but loyal to God and is willing to do anything to protect his order. However, for Dazai, this is a huge leap for his character that seemingly comes out of nowhere. In a matter of minutes, he goes from a well-meaning man that yearns for self-improvement to an extremely smug douchebag with slicked back hair. It's cartoonishly over the top, and it doesn't really work well for this character. Other than that, I do think Dazai serves his purpose as this game's law rep, and the story surrounding him makes sense for his alignment. The writers just sort of jumped the shark near the end of it, but it doesn't tarnish what came before it. The other two alignment reps in comparison are a bit more of a mixed bag for me. There's Shohei Yakumo and Yuzuru Atsuta. Yakumo is the game's neutral rep, though I think dark neutral would be a better description. Yakumo despises demons, and believes that humanity would be better off without any demonic influences. It's eventually revealed that his mindset spawned from a personal experience where his family was seduced by demons before being slaughtered. This experience showed Yakumo how harsh reality could be, and he learned to never trust demons or angels because of this. Yakumo values his fellow man above all else, but what sets him apart from most neutral representatives is the way he perceives humans. In his mind, humans have limitless potential. However, he has a very stern outlook on humanity. He views those that can't fight for themselves as worthless and would be better off dead. Despite deeply caring for humans, Yakumo Yakumo believes that relying on demons and angels will stagnate their growth, and that humanity should work together in the future. His goal is to destroy the throne of creation, and force the remaining humans to shape the world without the influence of any gods or demons. However, this will come at the cost of letting the fake Tokyo created by God's miracle fade away, meaning that any human not currently in the netherworld will die alongside it. Another interesting tidbit revolving around this character is that in order to accomplish his goals, Yakumo teams up with the Chinese goddess Nua. You'd think that Yakumo would be against the idea of getting help from a demon, but I guess that he makes an exception because they both share a love for humanity. It's also implied that their relationship runs much deeper than what we're first shown, but this is up for the player to infer, and that's honestly a running trend with this character. We don't get to learn a whole lot about Yakumo personally, and any information we do get is delivered to us through optional dialogue. The few times we run into him and Nua are used to express his alignment, more so than fleshing out his character beyond the basics. The stuff regarding Yakumo's upbringing and motivation is sort of just dumped on the player in the last area of the game, and even so, there's a lot of blanks that you need to fill in yourself if you want to get the most out of him. At the very least, it's more than what Yuzuru gets. God, this feels like such a wasted character. Yuzuru is meant to be the Chaos representative along with Koshimizu. To give the game credit, I actually do think the idea behind the Chaos ending is far more nuanced this time around. Previous SMT games have been pretty formulaic in the way they've portrayed the Chaos alignment. Usually, this boils down to a survival of the fittest mentality. The strong should rule over the weak and personal strength matters above all else. However, the Chaos route in SMT V manages to avoid falling into this trap. What Koshimizu, and by extent Yuzuru, set out to do is to create a world not governed by a single higher entity, but restore the era of myriad gods. In a way, they'll be hitting the reset switch and bring the world back to a time before God came into power. While this goal is noble, it's ultimately a short-sighted one since Koshimizu and Yuzuru fail to notice any drawbacks with their proposed future. While a world governed by multiple gods may sound like a good idea on paper, their clashing ideologies is a recipe for never-ending conflicts. While this ending still sticks to the traditional Chaos theme of freedom, there's a lot more for you to think about since it taps into the concepts of myriad gods, which is something that this series hasn't really tackled before. If I were to just look at the questions posed by this alignment on its own, then I find it very interesting. However, the representative attached to this alignment in question leaves a lot to be desired. This is entirely because there are no points where Yuzuru becomes the center of attention like Dazai does. This feeling permeates throughout the game, to the point where it almost feels as though there was cut content surrounding this character. It's almost shocking how much more attention Dazai gets than Yuzuru. The entire third area of the game has Dazai tag along with the protagonist. We get to see the mentorship between himself and Abdiel, and there's even a point where Dazai starts to question Koshimizu's leadership abilities. I wish that something like this was done for Yuzuru too, because after the first area of the game, he almost exclusively acts as the yes man to Koshimizu. He's easily the most disappointing aspect of this narrative to me, which is a shame. With that, there's only one more ending to discuss, the alternative neutral ending. But before we dive right in, let's just cover how exactly alignments work in this game, and see what you need to do to unlock this path. Throughout the game, you're given dialogue options that can shift your alignment, but much like Apocalypse, these decisions don't have an impact on what ending you get. Rather, you choose which ending you want in the final stretch of the game. If your protagonist's alignment matches with the character you sided with, you'll receive gameplay bonuses in the form of exclusive miracles. While I do appreciate that you're rewarded with sticking to your alignment, I prefer the method that was used in 4. While the alignment system there had its own problems, I like the idea of being sorted into an alignment because of the actions I made throughout the game, but I can see why some players would prefer the way it's handled here. Getting whatever ending you want is really easy because it's just a binary choice, so if you plan on doing multiple playthroughs, you'll know exactly how to get the law, chaos, and neutral endings. Getting the 4th ending, however, is a bit of a different story. Since this is an alternate take on the neutral ending, you need to make sure you side with Yakumo at the end of the game, but before that, you need to fulfill certain requirements. What this boils down to is that you need to finish a certain set of side quests before the alignment lock. Here's the thing, not only doesn't the game tell you at all what side quests are required to unlock the 4th ending, but almost all the ones you have to do have no relation to what happens in that route. The only quest that makes sense as a requirement is completing the optional boss fight against Shiva, because he plans on destroying the universe so that his god Brahman can step in as the new ruler. The other 3 quests are meant to tie up loose ends surrounding the game's minor characters. The quests on their own are perfectly fine, and they add some extra life to this world and expand on story elements outside of the main plot. not. But forcing the player to do these quests for the sake of an alternate ending feels a bit arbitrary. I know that it's supposed to be a secret, but I think defeating Shiva would suffice well enough. But with that out of the way, what exactly happens in this ending? Well, it's actually rather straightforward. If you meet all the requirements and are on the neutral route, instead of destroying the throne of creation, you're instead given the opportunity to recreate the world for humanity alone. By erasing all gods and demons, there's the possibility that the world will finally break free from the never-ending cycle of death in creation. However, this creates a future filled with uncertainty. As I said, this ending is more of an alternate take on the neutral route, and it shares a lot of similarities with the freedom ending from Nocturne. The main differences lie in the fact that the protagonist now exists as an all-seeing, all-knowing entity that spends his time observing the world he created. That is, until its eventual demise. Overall, the story of SMT V is a mixed bag for me. There are some great ideas presented in this story, but the execution leaves me wanting more. I understand that mainline SMT has always been more about presenting grand themes and ideas to the player rather than having super defined characters, but when comparing the narratives of SMT V to games such as 4 and even Nocturne, there's a huge step back in quality. This is because the plots of those games had a much more clear vision from the start. SMT V, on the other hand, while having an interesting start, ends up meandering for most of the game's runtime. It isn't until the final hours of the game when the true conflict is introduced, which is far too late in my eyes. The entire appeal of the narrative is the ongoing debate between the different alignments. It's the game's duty to lay them all out to the player, and have them make the tough choice as to who they're going to side with. While the alignments themselves are far more nuanced and give the player more to think about, the way that they're integrated into the story is rather poor. The story of Nocturne is just as minimalistic as the one featured in 5, but that game does a much better job at organically interweaving the game's alignments into the story it's trying to tell, and as I already went over, the same applies to SMT IV. At the end of the day, while the narrative of SMT V isn't terrible, it's lacking in a lot of areas, and it rarely rises above being just okay, and in some way, that makes it even more disappointing. All in all, Shin Megami Tensei V has become one of my favorite entries in the entire Megami Tensei franchise. The combat has been refined to a T, and character customization has been brought to new heights thanks to how it's woven into exploration. This creates an incredibly satisfying and engaging gameplay loop, since you're encouraged to tackle all of the game's content, and let me just tell you that this worked. I maxed out my level, did all the quests, got all the endings, beat the Demi-Fiend without the repel physical exploit, and even completely filled out the Compendium. Not just for the sake of providing the most thorough review I could, but because this has been one of the most fun games I've played in a very long time. I finished my first playthrough at 45 hours, but I easily doubled that by tackling everything SMT V had to offer, and you know what? I would do it all again if given the chance. Yes, the story is a bit underwhelming, but I think that there are some really interesting concepts and ideas presented. There's a lot more merit to this story than people have been giving credit for, and it succeeds at getting the player to think. But at the same time, I recognize that there are a lot of flaws with this narrative. The characters needed more screen time and development for their beliefs to feel realized. The story's pacing is a huge problem since for most of the game, the narrative feels rather directionless. It's a shame that since SMT IV, we've taken a step back with how alignments have been integrated into the story. However, much like with Apocalypse, its gameplay makes up in the areas where its story falls flat. But unlike Apocalypse, Shin Megami Tensei V is my new gold standard for how a mainline title should play. Let's just hope that next time, the story gets the same amount of polish. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I'd like to give a special shout out to all of my channel supporters whose names are on screen now. It's because of these lovely people that I'm able to make videos at the pace I do currently. These videos take a while to make, so if you're at all interested in helping out and donating, you can do so through my Patreon or through channel memberships. I have a few things I can offer in return, such as early video access, a special Discord role, and even some behind the scenes content on occasion. Every donation helps, and if these rewards at all sound interesting to you, then you can find out more by following the links in the description. At the time of this recording, this channel just recently passed 30,000 subscribers, and it's still something that I haven't fully grasped just yet. 2021 has been a big year for the channel, both in terms of growth as well as video quality. I'm very grateful to everyone who has supported me so far. Whether that be a longtime viewer or someone who's just found the channel, I can't thank you all enough from the bottom of my heart, and I hope we can make 2022 even better. In terms of future projects, I've got a few things planned, such as videos on the rest of the Persona spin-off titles, Digital Devil Saga 2, Kingdom Hearts 2, and many more. If you'd like to stay up to date with all that and more, please follow my Twitter or join my Discord server. Both will be linked in the description. Once again, I'd like to thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all next time.